We have a sermon and then a video after the sermon. So let me tell you just quickly about the video. This morning, I got a message from an old friend of mine who is a singer-songwriter in Nashville. And he said, I saw that your husband Toby is going to be giving the sermon today, and he's a Vietnam vet. My dad was too, and I wrote a song about it and just made a music video around it. So I wrote him this morning. I'm like, I watched it. Toby and I both just teared up watching it. It is very powerful. And I wrote him, I said, can we show it? And he said, yes. So we are going to end the sermon with this music video by my friend Kevin Doherty out of Nashville, and it's very powerful, and I think it dovetails with Toby's sermon quite well. Now, we will start, however, with the sermon, and of course I got to brag a little bit about the preacher today. You know, I know him a little bit. He also happens to be my husband, Toby Solberg. Toby graduated Harvard University in 1967. And was headed to law school, but got drafted before he could even set foot in the door. He served in Vietnam from 1969 to 1970 as a combat engineer in the highlands near Pleiku. When he returned from Vietnam, he attended NYU Law School, was then an associate at the firm of Webster Sheffield. After that, he served as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, and then as associate general counsel of Citicorp Holding Company right here in New York City. Maybe most importantly, he has on, I just saw, the most incredible pair of cowboy boots I have ever seen in my entire life. I know I've seen them before, but you know there's a heavy message coming with these boots, let me tell you. And I have heard the sermon, and it is a powerful message today that just brings such a personal and unique perspective on war and duty and gratitude and faith. And so I'm so honored to introduce my husband, Toby Solberg, to offer our sermon. I was going to mention to the choir, there's going to be photographs in the video too, so if you guys would like to come out and sit so you can see, thank you for mentioning that, Toby.
Good morning, everybody. If you can't hear me or understand me, just raise your hand at any point. I want to make sure I can be heard. I was honored when Susan asked if I would like to offer a message for this Veterans Day. As I am a veteran, you might expect my message to be straightforward, a gung-ho voice, celebrating our military, evoking the patriotic feelings we all experience when that parade goes by. My view is a bit more complex. As a Christian and a veteran, I have found the issues of war and service and faith complicated. I have two themes for this Veterans Day message. As Americans, we should support our vets and our military, and as people of faith, we should think long and hard about wars, particularly the voluntary kind. First, I believe wholeheartedly we should support our vets, current and future. During the Gulf War, I was on a domestic plane flight, and before leaving the gate, the pilot announced that we had to wait a few minutes for some special guests. Shortly, the hostess ushered into the main cabin a group of young men and women wearing the fatigue uniforms of our nation's military, as the pilot announced that they were headed for service in Iraq. The passengers broke into applause. The pilot, obviously himself a veteran, poked his head into the cabin to watch with a smile. We were all proud of them, our young people heading overseas to serve and do battle for us. My experience was a bit different. My service came in the Vietnam War, the most unpopular war in American history. Believe it or not, that's me. When I traveled around the U.S. in my uniform, nobody cheered, nobody clapped. People looked anywhere but at me. The rare kind word or smile came only from veterans. When I came home in 1970 from my tour as a combat engineer in Vietnam, We got off a transport plane. That's a picture of me in Cameron Bay waiting for what we call the Freedom Plane, Freedom Bird. I did get home. We got off a transport plane at an Air Force base outside of Seattle and walked under a big sign that read, "Welcome home, soldier. America is proud of you." 24 hours later, I was dropped off at the Seattle airport by an Army bus wearing a new uniform for my trip home and clutching my new orders discharging me from the Army. I wasn't quite ready to go home. My head was spinning from the transition from the jungle, thousands of miles away, to a cool April evening in the Pacific Northwest. I found a payphone and called a college friend who was then a graduate student in Seattle. Before long, Bob pulled up at the curb in his car. He did a wonderful thing for me. He took me skiing in the nearby Cascade Mountains for a couple of days. It was a great transition. Everywhere I looked, people were smiling, nobody was shooting, and it couldn't have been further from the jungle. But before we went skiing, we stopped at the house that Bob shared with some other graduate students. Bob introduced me. "This is my friend Toby. He just got home from Vietnam." Not one of them would shake my hand. The sign I'd walked under, "Welcome home, soldier, America is proud of you," was a lie. America was not proud of me. America was ashamed of me. Definitely a Veterans Day contradiction. I did get home. That's me with my mother on the day I got back. I started law school that fall. I didn't tell anyone I was a veteran. I pushed Vietnam into the back of my mind, and I buckled down to making a life for myself. Some 15 years later, another vet stuck his head into my office and called my attention to the Veterans Day parade outside because Vietnam veterans were marching and people were cheering. Times had changed. Attitudes had changed. Indeed, today, veterans are mainstream. Marketing-driven organizations, just look at the National Football League, are highlighting thank you veterans messages in their advertising and merchandise. But I'll never be able to shake the memory that I once put everything I had on the line for my country, and my country was not grateful. Vietnam and Korea were departures for Americans. The wars that had gone before were easy to understand. The Revolution, to make us free. The Civil War, to keep our country together and to abolish slavery. And above all, World War II, the global struggle against tyranny, totalitarianism, oppression, hatred, cruelty, the Holocaust. And all Americans dug deep for that one. I think of my grandparents who lived in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, their entire lives. They had 3 children. It's my grandparents in the front, 2 sons, John and Bob, in the back, and my mother, Barbara, on the right. All 3 went off to war. My Uncle John went to England to train with the 101st Airborne to invade France. My Uncle Bob went to a destroyer in the Pacific, and my mother joined the Red Cross and was posted on the distant Pacific island of New Caledonia. Now, not everything was bad in New Caledonia. My mother was a pianist, and part of her duties with the Red Cross were to welcome soldiers and sailors and Marines who came in for a little shore leave, and they liked nothing better than to sing the songs from back home thousands of miles away. But back in Eau Claire, one day an Army car pulled up outside my grandparents' house. An Army officer got out along with the pastor from Grandma's church. They gave her the bad news. Their son John had been killed in action in Normandy on D-Day. He's buried in the American Cemetery at Omaha Beach. I've been there. That's my son, who I took along. On his cross, with his name, rank, unit, dates, it says Wisconsin. If you look around at the other crosses in that cemetery, you'll see New York and North Carolina and Texas and California. Some of them are Stars of David. A long way from Eau Claire, Wisconsin. My mother's family was not unusual, don't get me wrong. It was a war that touched all Americans and was easy to understand. Not like Vietnam and Korea, wars, according to our leaders, intended to stop the spread of communism. Well, today communism is pretty much history, and not because we went to war in Vietnam and Korea. And more recently, the Gulf Wars. Much as our political leaders tried to stir us up against the dictator Saddam Hussein, depicting him as the reincarnation of World War II bad guys like Hitler and Stalin, the invasion of Iraq was about the global supply of oil. We sent our young people in harm's way for oil. Afghanistan's even harder to understand. It began as our pursuit of individual terrorists, our modern enemy. Terrorists are particularly difficult for conventional militaries because they don't wear uniforms. They step up, shoot you, drop a grenade in your Jeep, and then turn around and disappear into the civilian population. We had a taste of that with the Viet Cong. And look at Gaza today. Don't get me wrong about the Vietnam War. I'm proud to have served whatever the merits of the war. I hold with Stephen Decatur, the soldier and statesman who made his reputation by flushing pirate bands out of Tripoli in the War of 1812. Decatur once gave a toast. My country, may she always be right, but right or wrong, my country. I'm proud to have served my country. Support the vets, it's the right thing to do. That said, question the wars. The truth is, it's a little too easy for us to wage wars these days. They're fought on the other side of the world, far from our daily view, by volunteers. I always felt that we are lucky to live in America, and that we citizens have an obligation to give something back, whether it's military service, alternative service, teacher corps, job corps, peace corps, whatever. Our lives today are pretty cushy compared to most of the world. We have only to look at the numbers of refugees and immigrants trying to share what we and European Union countries have. Apart from 9/11, we're pretty far removed from the military conflict sites in the world. We have to read history to remind ourselves that our forefathers spilled a lot of blood right here in the United States to get us to the liberties and luxuries we enjoy. New York City was occupied by the enemy during the Revolution, right here. There were battles on Long Island, in Brooklyn, in White Plains. George Washington moved his army across the Hudson River right where the GW Bridge is today. We haven't had a military war on American soil since the Civil War. In today's global society, we tend to send our soldiers far away. And the troops we send are volunteers. The bulk of service in the Vietnam War at the level of the ordinary soldier was borne by draftees like me. We didn't volunteer. We went under compulsion. Imagine that today every male, your children, your friends, your relatives, as he turns 18, gets a letter, says you're now 1A. You're ready to go. Be ready, you can be called, and you will be called. One thing ties all wars together. They tend to be declared by old people, our politicians, and fought by young people. A former business colleague of mine, a venture capitalist banker then in his 60s, had a brilliant idea. Bill pointed out that wars have always been fought by young men because they think they're immortal. They think war is going to be an adventure. Bill pointed out that we should send old people off to fight instead. They've already had a life, and older people are less likely to cooperate. Picture the World War I scene of the troops in the trenches, and an officer shouts, "Over the top, boys, charge!" The troops in the trenches, average age 65, respond, "My back's a little stiff today. My arthritic knees are kind of acting up. It's not a good day for a charge. Maybe tomorrow." They're also more likely to argue. Why should we charge? They've got machine guns. It's dangerous, not to mention pointless. This idea, sending the old folks off to fight the wars that they declare, could be the end of warfare at long last. Support the vets, but the best thing we can do for our vets is save their lives. Decide not to wage a voluntary war on the other side of the world. And support those who are in uniform now. Our military, as part of our constitutional system of checks and balances, are pledged to serve and support the American people and the Constitution, not the politicians, not even the president. Recently, a sitting president is reported to have ordered the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to mobilize troops in support of a domestic partisan political action. The chairman rightly refused, earning himself the enmity of the president and his followers. We need to support our bipartisan military for our political survival. These are important moral issues. Maybe we can find some guidance in our faith. Well, if there are two features of this world more intertwined than religion and war, I don't know what they are. In the 2,000 years since the birth of Christ, try to find a war that wasn't fought over religion, that didn't invoke religion on one or both sides, that didn't represent people trying to pull God into their human disputes. Before my service, I very nearly witnessed a war that didn't involve Christians, but which presaged today's conflict in Gaza. In the summer of 1967, I was part of a singing group on tour, and we had a concert scheduled in Jerusalem. It happened to be the summer of the 6 Days War. And we didn't know until just before the scheduled date whether we'd even be able to get into Israel. But the war ended in time. We sang in Jerusalem. And incidentally, we were allowed a look at the legendary Wailing Wall, which before the war, that war, had been concealed by the Arabs behind another wall, preventing Jews from visiting their holy site. You can see the piles of rubble which were left after the Israelis blew up the wall that concealed their Wailing Wall. You can't tell from the picture, but I can tell you that when we got there, the rubble was smoking. Arabs and Jews have been at each other's throats for a long time, but they have never outdone Christians. There's hardly been a period in Christian history without a Christian war going on somewhere. Christians against Muslims, Catholics against Protestants, Protestants against other Protestants, everybody against indigenous faiths. Think of considered non-believers. Think about the Aztecs and the Incas in Central and South America with those Spanish troops led by Jesuit priests massacring because they didn't believe. Wars without declaring war. The Inquisition, in which the only Christian church of the day virtually declared war on its own people, all over matters of minor church dogma, all in the name of Christ. And if the war wasn't directly over religion, religion was invoked, often by both sides. Think about the Civil War with famously pious generals on their knees, praying to God to give them the strength to kill each other, and then thanking God for giving them the victory. All this involves some basic human presumptions, none of them consistent with the teachings of Christ. The presumption that God would approve of war, the presumption that God would take sides in a war, the presumption that God would want to get involved in such human stupidity at all. There's always been comfort for Christian warmongers in the Old Testament, the concept of an eye for an eye, as we heard in our scripture today, and in the many accounts of ancient wars, the righteous extinction by God himself of the Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea, the reduction of Jericho, David and Goliath. Yet the Old Testament also has Moses on the mountaintop receiving the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, one of the most memorable, thou shalt not kill. Not thou shalt not kill Christians. Thou shalt not kill, plain and simple. And then there's the New Testament, the life of Christ, the ultimate pacifist. Can anyone reading the Beatitudes actually think that Christ would think it was okay to kill Southerners or Northerners or members of another faith or people of no faith? The teachings of Christ, the very essence of Christianity, tell us that killing is a sin. Despite 2,000 years of human effort to the contrary, there's no justification in the story of Christ for killing each other. Quite the contrary. That said, Jesus wasn't in the Central Highlands of Vietnam back in 1969 and 1970 when we got attacked. Maybe he was there. We didn't have time to consult. There was no opportunity at Pearl Harbor for our soldiers and sailors to ask what to do. Is it wrong to defend yourself? Is it wrong to defend your country? Like most American veterans, I consider myself a religious man. There's a great saying in the military: there are no atheists in foxholes. Think about that. So I'm conflicted about Veterans Day. I'm conflicted about the Vietnam War, torn between pride in my service, shame at my country's reaction, regret that my country saw fit to spend my service in so poor a cause, guilt at surviving the war when 60,000 did not. In the 10 years of that war, 20 Americans were killed every day. I'm conflicted about the use of Christianity throughout its history by my fellow humans as an excuse for systematically violating the most fundamental precept of our faith. That's a lot of conflict for a holiday. There's a parade. There are brass bands, waving flags, cheering children. A lot of old men marching in uniforms that are a little too tight. The Shriners show up at a lot of these parades and buzz around Fifth Avenue in their fezzes and their cute little cars. Maybe I ought not to take myself so seriously. Maybe I ought to forget about contradictions and conflicts so natural to our human condition. Maybe I just ought to bask in the cheers and thanks of my countrymen, however flawed, and not worry about my equally flawed self. After all, we're only human. And maybe that's the answer. Even God doesn't expect us to match Jesus' idealistic teachings, just to do our best. And that's what our veterans did, all of them. In every war, we did our best. So let's do our best for them. Be active in our democracy. Vote. Encourage others to register and vote. Inform yourself. Voice your convictions. Listen respectfully to others as they do the same. Be proud of our veterans and work to make our country a place that they will be proud to come home to. And remember, it's never too late to say, welcome home. Around the year 2000, at a ceremony of some kind in Washington, I was introduced to Al Gore, who was then the Vice President of the United States. I knew his history. He'd been a couple of years behind me at Harvard, and he'd served in Vietnam a couple of years after me. So I said when I met him, Harvard 67, Vietnam 69. He looked me in the eye, held my hand for a few moments and said, "Welcome home." Those two words mean something to all of us, but especially us veterans. So question the wars, take care of our veterans, and maybe at long last, we can all believe in that sign, "Welcome home, soldier. America's proud of you." And the people said, amen.
Paul and Ronnie and me. We were 8 years old in '68, running fast so we could see. We shoved our knuckles through that chain link fence and watched those choppers coming in. Big birds came down with a thumping sound. Dust kicked up into our eyes as they hit the ground. Stretchers came off one by one, wounded soldiers, amputees, and I swear one of them looked right back at me. There was a price they paid, luck of the draw, someone pulled the short straw. Oh, I got to walk away, but now I'm old enough to know in this life there's a price. Not everybody pays, not everybody pays, not everybody pays. Jimmy's mom couldn't sleep at night, and Paul's dad came back, but his mind just wasn't right. It'd been a year since my dad was gone, and Ronnie's dad, he never made it home. There was a price they paid, luck of the draw, someone pulled the short straw. Oh, I got to walk away. Now I'm old enough to know in this life there's a price. Not everybody pays, not everybody pays, not everybody pays. Years later now, I can't forget. It's like a storm here in my chest. When I hear those choppers in my dreams, that boy didn't know, but the man in me can see what they lost and what it cost. There was a price they paid, luck of the draw, someone pulled the short straw. Oh, I got